Donald Trump sees a struggling guard. His next move shocks the nation. Ethan Carter stood in the cold night air, his breath forming small clouds as he adjusted the collar of his dark blue uniform. The towering government building loomed behind him, its windows dark and lifeless at this hour. Most nights were the same, long, quiet hours with nothing but the distant hum of traffic and the echo of his own footsteps to keep him company. Powerful figures came and went, never sparing him a glance. To them, he was invisible, just another security guard doing a thankless job. But for Ethan, this job was all he had. Bills were piling up at home, and his daughter's college tuition loomed like a shadow he couldn't outrun. The man he used to be, a Marine who had led men through battlefields, felt like a memory from a different life. Now, every night blurred into the next, each shift a reminder of how far he had fallen. He remembered the day he got home from his last deployment, his uniform pressed and his chest heavy with medals. Back then, people called him a hero, shook his hand at the grocery store, and thanked him for his service. That didn't last. The job interviews came and went, each rejection letter stinging worse than the last. Without a degree or connections, his skills as a leader, a strategist, a protector, none of it seemed to matter. His wife tried to reassure him, told him to keep looking, but with every overdue notice that hit the mailbox, Ethan felt the weight of his failures grow. He took the security job to keep food on the table, to keep the lights on, but every time he saluted a politician or a wealthy businessman striding past him without a second glance, a small voice whispered in his mind, "Is this really all that's left for you?" It was nearly midnight when the deep rumble of engines shattered the silence. Ethan straightened, eyes narrowing as a convoy of black SUVs rolled smoothly into the courtyard. Secret Service agents stepped out first, scanning the area with sharp eyes before one of them opened the door to the lead vehicle. Ethan didn't need a closer look to recognize the man who emerged, Donald Trump, flanked by a wall of security. Most nights, Trump would stride past without a word, eyes fixed ahead, but tonight was different. As he approached, Trump slowed, his gaze locking directly onto Ethan. For a moment, Ethan's breath caught. He stood a little straighter, eyes forward, hands clasped tightly behind his back. He was used to being ignored, to blending into the background, but the intensity of Trump's gaze made it clear that, for the first time, someone had noticed him. Trump stopped, just a few feet away, and for a heartbeat, the world seemed to hold its breath. Then, in a voice both direct and unexpected, he asked, "How's your night going, officer?" Ethan hesitated, caught off guard. In all the years he'd worked this post, no one of Trump's stature had ever spoken to him, let alone waited for a response. His throat felt dry, but he managed a steady reply. "All good, sir." Trump didn't move on. He studied Ethan with a sharp, almost analytical gaze, as if seeing something beyond the uniform and the title. The silence stretched, heavy and uncertain. Then, with a slight nod, Trump spoke again, his voice calm but curious. "You served in the military, didn't you?" The question landed like a punch. Ethan's mind raced. There were no medals on his chest, no insignia to give him away. But something, maybe the way he stood, the way he observed every movement around him, had tipped Trump off. "Yes, sir," Ethan replied, keeping his voice steady. 8 years in the Marines." Trump nodded slowly, a thoughtful look in his eyes. 8 years, that's a long time, he said. "And now you're here." There was no judgment in the words, but Ethan felt the sting of them all the same. Before he could think of what to say, Trump asked, almost casually, "Tell me, do you think this building is truly secure?" Ethan blinked, thrown by the question. His training told him to give the standard response, but something in Trump's tone made him pause. He thought about the security flaws he'd noticed but never mentioned, the weak spots in the surveillance system, the blind spots in the cameras. His jaw tightened. "I believe we do our best to keep it safe, sir," he said carefully. Trump's eyes narrowed, the faintest hint of a smile tugging at the corner of his mouth. "Doing your best doesn't always mean it's enough," he replied. "If you had the power to change the security system here, what would you do differently?" Ethan's heart pounded. This wasn't just small talk. Trump was asking him, actually listening. For the first time in years, Ethan felt something stirred deep in his chest, something he thought he had lost long ago, a spark of hope. Ethan's mind raced as Trump's question hung in the air, but even as he stood there, struggling to find the right words, memories began to creep in. shadows from a past life that seemed a world away from the cold stone steps of the government building. He could almost smell the desert air, hear the muffled radio chatter, and the roar of helicopters overhead. Back then, life had been simple, even when it was deadly. Orders were clear, your brothers had your back, and every day had a purpose. Ethan had been a leader, trusted by his men to make decisions that could mean the difference between life and death. He had worn his uniform with pride, not just because of what it meant to others, but because of what it meant to him. A chance to protect, to lead, to make a difference. But the battlefield didn't prepare him for what came next. When the final deployment ended and the parades were over, Ethan found himself alone in a cramped apartment, medals tucked away in a drawer, and a resume that seemed to gather dust no matter how many times he updated it. Job interviews blurred together, each rejection letter hitting harder than the last. They all said the same thing without saying it at all. Leadership and courage didn't mean much without a college degree or the right connections. The savings ran out faster than he expected, and soon the bills started to pile up. His daughter's college fund had dwindled to nothing, forcing him to tell her that maybe next semester she'd be able to go back. Her smile had been brave, but he'd seen the disappointment in her eyes. That hurt more than any battle wound ever could. The security job was supposed to be temporary, just something to keep the lights on while he figured things out. But weeks turned to months, and months turned to years. Before long, the uniform fit a little too well, and the routine settled into his bones. He went from protecting his country to watching doors, from making life or death decisions to being ignored by every person who passed him by. When a promotion opportunity opened up, he put everything he had into his application. His military service, commendations, letters of recommendation from former commanders. For a moment, he dared to believe that someone might actually see his worth. But when the announcement came, it was the same as always. The job went to a man half his age with a degree and a smooth smile. Ethan wasn't even given an explanation, just a pat on the shoulder and a reminder to keep up the good work. Every night, he wrestled with the same questions, lying awake long after his shift had ended. Was this it? Was this how the rest of his life would go? Standing guard for men who didn't even know his name? Doing a job that could be replaced tomorrow without anyone noticing? He knew he was capable of more, but every door seemed locked tight, every opportunity out of reach. His wife tried to comfort him, her voice gentle but tired as she told him to give it time, that something would come along. But the bills didn't stop coming, and the phone calls from debt collectors were getting harder to ignore. His daughter's college dreams were slipping further away with each passing month. So when Trump stopped and looked him in the eye, actually asked him what he thought, it felt almost cruel. To remember, even for a moment, what it was like to be seen, to have someone listen and not just hear. Ethan knew it was dangerous to hope, that wanting more had only ever led to disappointment. But as he stood there, uniform stiff with cold and hands clenched behind his back, he couldn't help it. Maybe this was the moment he had been waiting for, the one chance to prove that he was more than just a shadow by the door. Ethan's heart pounded as Trump's eyes stayed fixed on him, waiting for an answer. It felt like the world had shrunk down to just the two of them. The billionaire who had the power to change lives with a single word, and the security guard who had long since stopped believing anyone would notice him. For a moment, Ethan's mind went blank. He was used to questions he could answer without thinking. Everything good tonight? Or any issues on your shift? The kind that didn't require more than a polite nod or a simple yes, sir. But this was different. Trump's question was sharp and deliberate, cutting through the silence with the kind of weight that demanded more than a rehearsed response. It wasn't every day that a man like Donald Trump asked you what you thought, actually wanted to know, not out of courtesy, but because he seemed to care about the answer. Ethan forced himself to take a breath, trying to calm the nerves that tightened his chest. He thought about the countless nights he'd spent pacing these halls, the flaws he'd noticed and couldn't fix. His eyes drifted for a second to the surveillance camera in the corner, the one with the blind spot by the emergency exit, and to the cracked concrete near the south fence, where the lighting was so poor that anyone could slip by unnoticed. He'd reported those issues more times than he could count, but the budget was always tight, and there was always some reason why it couldn't be fixed. Still, voicing those concerns now felt like a risk. Who was he to tell someone like Trump that things weren't as secure as they seemed? But Trump didn't look impatient or dismissive. If anything, his eyes seemed to narrow with interest, as if he could see the hesitation in Ethan's expression and was waiting to see if he'd have the guts to speak up. Ethan clenched his fists behind his back, the leather of his gloves creaking softly. If he stayed silent now, if he let this moment pass without saying what was really on his mind, he knew he'd regret it for the rest of his life. So, he swallowed the doubt and took the chance. "Honestly, sir," he began, his voice steady but quiet, "there are a few things I'd change. The cameras in the West Wing haven't been upgraded in years. There's a blind spot near the emergency exit that anyone with half a brain could exploit. And the lighting along the south perimeter is so dim, you wouldn't even see someone coming until they were at the door." The words came out faster than he'd intended, a rush of thoughts he'd been holding back for months. He half expected Trump to cut him off, to smirk or wave him away, but instead, Trump leaned in slightly, his eyes never leaving Ethan's. "Go on," he said, his tone even and unreadable. That single prompt sent a surge of adrenaline through Ethan's veins. It was like a dam breaking. He talked about the outdated keycard system, how anyone who had access years ago might still be able to get in. He mentioned the gaps in the patrol schedule, how the guards' rotations were too predictable, how someone could time their movements with just a few days of watching. The more he spoke, the more the tension in his shoulders eased. For once, someone was actually listening, not out of obligation, but because they genuinely wanted to hear what he had to say. When he finally stopped, breathless and a little surprised at himself, Trump was quiet for a long moment. His gaze was sharp, calculating, as if weighing every word Ethan had said. Ethan's stomach churned with second thoughts. Maybe he'd said too much. Maybe he'd overstepped. But then Trump's mouth curved just slightly, not quite a smile, but close enough to steal the air from Ethan's lungs. "Interesting," Trump said slowly, the word carrying a weight that sent a chill down Ethan's spine. "You've clearly put a lot of thought into this." There was a pause, then a glint of something almost like challenge in Trump's eyes. "So, tell me, if you were in charge of security here, what would you do differently?" Ethan hesitated, taken off guard. He'd imagined 100 different endings to this conversation, but not this. Being asked for his opinion was one thing. Being asked how he would fix things was something else entirely. The thought was terrifying, but there was something else mixed in too, something that felt dangerously like hope. Ethan drew a breath, straightened his shoulders, and met Trump's gaze head-on. Maybe this was just small talk to Trump, something he'd forget by the time he reached the elevator. But for Ethan, it was more than that. It was a chance, maybe the only one he'd ever get, and he was done watching opportunities slip by without reaching for them. Ethan barely had time to process what had just happened when, the next morning, a man in a dark suit approached him with a sealed envelope. The presidential seal on the front made his hands tremble as he tore it open, heart pounding in his ears. Inside was a short, direct message, a request for a full security report detailing vulnerabilities in the current system and suggestions for fixing them, due in 1 week. Ethan stared at the words until they blurred. This had to be a mistake. He was just a guard. Writing reports was for people with degrees in cybersecurity, not for someone who spent his nights checking doors and watching monitors. For a moment, he almost laughed at the absurdity of it. But the paper in his hands was real, the ink crisp and dark, and at the bottom, in a signature that left no room for doubt, was Donald Trump's name. His first instinct was to refuse, to find someone, anyone, who could take this off his hands. He didn't belong in the same room as people who made these decisions, let alone advising them. But as he gripped the letter, Trump's words echoed in his mind. Leaders don't need to have all the answers. They just need to know how to find them. Ethan's jaw clenched. The thought of failing, of making a fool of himself in front of men who wore suits that cost more than his car, was almost enough to make him tear the letter up right there. But the memory of Trump's steady gaze, the way he'd actually listened without interrupting, held his hands still. For years, Ethan had wanted a chance, just one, to prove he was worth more than standing guard at the door. Now it was here, staring him in the face, and he couldn't bring himself to walk away. That night, long after his shift ended, Ethan found himself hunched over his kitchen table, papers spread in a messy arc, a half-empty coffee cup growing cold by his elbow. His wife had gone to bed hours ago, but he stayed, eyes gritty with exhaustion as he scribbled notes and flipped through manuals he hadn't touched in years. Military handbooks, old security protocols, even articles he'd printed out from the internet, anything that might help. Every time the doubts crept in, telling him he was wasting his time, that this was a test he was bound to fail, he forced himself to keep writing. He spent hours on the phone, calling old friends from the Marines, men who'd gone on to work for private security firms or cybersecurity companies. Their voices were gruff with sleep or surprise, but they didn't hesitate to answer his questions, to send files and advice. Days blurred into each other, the hours marked only by the cooling cups of coffee and the growing pile of crumpled notes by the trash can. He moved through the building during his shifts with new eyes, memorizing camera angles, noting patrol patterns, testing door locks when no one was watching. Every time a guard gave him a confused look, he mumbled something about routine checks and moved on. He could almost hear the whispers behind his back. What's he playing at? But he didn't have time to care. Each flaw he uncovered, each weakness in the system, felt like another weight on his shoulders, but also like a step forward. He wrote it all down, the words coming faster the longer he went, until the pages were covered in cramped handwriting and hastily drawn diagrams. On the fourth night, fatigue crashed into him like a wave. Sitting alone at the kitchen table, eyes burning and fingers stiff, he dropped his pen with a sigh. This was insane. He didn't have a degree, didn't have the qualifications for this. What was he even doing? But then, almost as if summoned by the thought, Trump's words came back, about how leaders find answers, even if they don't have them all. Ethan's fingers twitched around the pen. Maybe he didn't have a degree, but he had 8 years of keeping his men alive in places where one mistake could get them killed. He knew how to spot a weakness, how to think like someone trying to get in. That had to count for something. So he kept going, piecing the report together one line at a time, double-checking every detail, marking out the flaws he'd seen with red ink and writing suggestions beside them. It wasn't perfect. It wasn't even close. But it was the best he could do, and as he looked down at the stack of papers, exhaustion dragging at his eyelids, a flicker of something close to pride sparked in his chest. For the first time in years, he felt a purpose beyond just making it to the next paycheck. No matter what happened next, whether Trump threw the report away without a second glance or tore it apart line by line, Ethan knew he'd done everything he could. That had to be enough. Ethan was halfway through his shift, fighting off exhaustion with yet another cup of stale coffee, when the alarms shattered the silence. The sound was deafening, a high-pitched wail that seemed to come from everywhere at once, and for a second, all he could do was freeze, heart pounding. But instinct took over fast. He dropped the coffee, not even flinching when it splashed across the tile, and sprinted to the security control room. The red emergency lights were already flashing, painting the walls in harsh shadows. Officers scrambled in confusion, hands fumbling over radios and keyboards, their voices clashing in a mess of panic and questions. But Ethan's eyes went straight to the monitor on the far wall, the one showing the West Wing, the exact area he'd flagged in his report just days ago. His gut twisted at the sight. The camera feeds were glitching, cutting in and out, but there was no mistaking the shadow slipping through the blind spot by the emergency exit. That entrance was supposed to be sealed, but there it was on the screen, just as he'd warned, just as everyone had assured him wasn't a priority. Swearing under his breath, Ethan snatched a radio from the desk, voice steady despite the adrenaline burning in his veins. "We have an unauthorized breach in the West Wing, emergency exit C," he barked. "I need a team there now. No one moves without my order." The other guards hesitated, glancing at each other with wide eyes, but there was no time to argue. When no one else moved, Ethan did. He grabbed a tactical vest, loaded his sidearm, and headed for the West Wing at a dead run, boots slamming against the tile. The corridors were a blur of flashing lights and shouting, but Ethan's mind was clear, every step mapped out ahead of him. He'd spent the past week memorizing these halls, planning for a scenario he'd never thought would actually happen. Each turn, each emergency door, each potential blind spot, it was all there in his head, a map he followed without thinking. As he rounded the last corner, he caught sight of 2 other guards standing frozen, eyes darting nervously to the glitching cameras. Ethan jerked his chin at them, voice cutting through the chaos like a blade. "You with me. You, lock down the west entrance. No one gets in or out." They hesitated, but something in his tone snapped them to attention. For the first time in years, people were listening to him again, not out of obligation, but because they trusted him to know what to do. They moved quickly, keeping low, guns drawn as they crept down the corridor. Every nerve in Ethan's body was stretched tight, ears straining for any sound over the wailing alarms. Then, A shuffle of footsteps just ahead. Ethan held up a fist, the signal to stop, and the guards behind him froze instantly. He edged forward, breath shallow, eyes fixed on the shadows shifting by the server room door. The emergency lights flickered, plunging the hall into darkness for a heartbeat. When they flared back on, he saw it, the glint of metal by the door handle, a gloved hand connecting some kind of device to the panel. No time to think. Ethan surged forward, gun leveled, voice a sharp command. Freeze. Hands in the air. The intruder twisted fast, too fast. There was a flash, the crack of a gunshot, and the guard beside Ethan stumbled back with a grunt of pain. Rage flared hot and blinding, and Ethan didn't hesitate. 2 steps forward, a hard tackle that sent them both crashing to the ground, fists slamming into Kevlar. The fight was short but brutal, ending with the intruder pinned to the tile, wrists wrenched behind his back. Ethan's breath sawed in and out, eyes darting to the device still blinking on the server room door. It was small, almost harmless looking, but the way it pulsed sent a chill down his spine. Data extraction, or worse. He didn't need a tech degree to recognize a serious threat when he saw one. Before he could radio for backup, footsteps pounded down the hall, fast and purposeful. Ethan's head jerked up, eyes narrowing as a group of men in dark suits rounded the corner, Secret Service, weapons drawn. They swept in without a word, securing the area with cold precision. But the man who followed them made Ethan's blood run cold. Donald Trump, flanked by agents, eyes sharp and focused despite the chaos. For a second, Ethan's mind blanked. What was he even doing here at this hour? But then Trump's gaze flickered to the intruder on the ground, the blinking device, and finally to Ethan, assessing, calculating. The tension in the hall was suffocating, no one daring to move or speak until Trump stepped forward, eyes fixed on the device. One of the agents picked it up, muttering into a radio, but Trump barely seemed to notice. His attention stayed on Ethan, mouth curving just slightly in what could almost be called a smile. "Looks like you were right," Trump said, voice calm but edged with something Ethan couldn't place. Relief, maybe, or something darker. Ethan's throat was too tight to answer, adrenaline still thrumming in his veins, but he managed a stiff nod, jaw clenched. For a moment, all he could do was stare at the mess of broken glass and flickering lights, at the intruder being dragged away in cuffs. But then Trump clapped a hand on his shoulder, grip firm and steady. "Good work," he said simply, and for the first time in years, the praise didn't sting. Ethan straightened, chest heaving, but the knot of tension inside him began to unwind, slowly, cautiously, like an animal that had been caged too long. The danger wasn't over, not by a long shot. But for now, he'd done his part. He'd been heard, and he'd been right. For once, that was enough. The adrenaline was still wearing off when they gathered in the briefing room, the hum of fluorescent lights and the soft murmur of voices making Ethan's head throb. His hands were shaking, the reality of what just happened settling into his bones, but he forced himself to stay upright, back straight, eyes ahead. A dozen men in suits filled the room, some with earpieces and serious faces, others whispering into phones with clipped tones. But all of them kept glancing his way, eyes narrowing with a mixture of curiosity and something else, something that looked a lot like respect. That alone felt surreal. For years, Ethan had been a shadow, a man people looked through rather than at. Now, they were listening, waiting for him to speak. The thought made his palms sweat, but there was no time to dwell on it. One of the Secret Service agents called for silence, voice firm and carrying, and just like that, every conversation died. All eyes turned to the door. Trump walked in a moment later, expression unreadable, but his gaze went straight to Ethan. Even without the chaos and red emergency lights, the weight of it was the same, sharp, assessing, like a spotlight that saw right through him. Ethan tensed automatically, hands curling at his sides. Part of him still expected a reprimand, for someone to point out a flaw he'd missed, to remind him that he was just a guard who'd overstepped his place. But Trump didn't look angry. If anything, there was a glint of something almost like approval in his eyes as he stopped in front of Ethan, arms folded loosely. For a moment, he didn't say anything, letting the silence stretch until Ethan's nerves were raw. Then, with a slight nod, Trump spoke, voice calm but carrying a weight that hushed every breath in the room. "I read your report," Trump said simply, "and it seems you were right about more than just the West Wing." He held up a stack of papers. Ethan's report, every page covered in his cramped handwriting and red ink. The sight of it sent a fresh surge of panic through Ethan's veins. He'd stayed up for days writing that, second-guessing every line, convinced it wasn't good enough, that someone would tear it apart and send him back to standing guard without a second thought. But Trump's tone held no mockery, no condescension, just a blunt sort of respect that left Ethan's mouth dry. "You have a good eye," Trump continued, flipping through the pages with a faint smirk. "And it's clear you've been wasting your time out there at the door." The words were so unexpected that Ethan's breath caught, eyes widening despite himself. He managed to stammer out a half-formed protest, something about just doing his job, but Trump waved it off with a sharp gesture. "If you were just doing your job," he said dryly, "we'd still be wondering how they got in." The room stayed deathly quiet, every agent and officer watching with barely concealed shock. Ethan could hardly breathe past the disbelief choking him. Part of him waited for the other shoe to drop, for someone to laugh or roll their eyes, to remind him where he actually stood. But then Trump's eyes narrowed, and his next words hit like a hammer to the chest. "I want you in charge of security," he said bluntly. Effective immediately. For a second, Ethan was sure he'd misheard. He stared, mouth opening and closing without a sound, fingers numb where they gripped his sides. In charge. The words didn't make sense. They couldn't. Not when he'd spent years being ignored, overlooked, waved aside. The thought alone was absurd, laughable, but Trump's expression didn't change. If anything, his eyes hardened, daring Ethan to argue. "Lead security strategist," Trump clarified, as if reading his mind. "Full clearance, your own team. We've wasted enough time." When Ethan still couldn't find his voice, Trump arched a brow, the faintest hint of impatience creeping in. "Unless you'd rather go back to checking ID badges," he added, tone dry but not unkind. That snapped Ethan out of it. He cleared his throat, barely managing to choke out a rough, "No, sir. I mean, yes. Thank you, sir." The words were a mess, clumsy and raw, but Trump's mouth twitched, almost a smile. Then he clapped a hand on Ethan's shoulder, grip firm and warm, and Ethan nearly flinched from the shock of it. It felt too real, too solid, like stepping out of a nightmare into daylight. For a heartbeat, all Ethan could do was stand there, breathing hard and trying to wrap his mind around what had just happened. His hands were still trembling when Trump turned to leave, barking orders to the agents, voice sharp and commanding. The room broke into motion instantly, men rushing to follow, but Ethan stayed rooted to the spot, staring at the crumpled papers in his hands. "Lead strategist. Full clearance." His throat felt tight, eyes stinging with something dangerously close to tears. He thought of his wife, her tired smile and soft reassurances that things would get better, of his daughter's hopeful eyes, the tuition bills piled on the kitchen table. For the first time in years, the future didn't look dark and uncertain. It looked bright, terrifyingly bright, with paths he hadn't dared to imagine. Ethan drew a shaky breath, blinking hard, and straightened his shoulders. Whatever came next, he was ready. Ethan walked through the front entrance of the government building, but this time, everything was different. His new ID badge hung heavily around his neck, not the simple laminated one he'd worn for years, but one with a photo, a title, and a level of clearance he hadn't even known existed a week ago. The guards at the door straightened as he approached, offering respectful nods and a quick "morning, sir," that still felt strange to his ears. Ethan returned the nod, his stride steady, but inside, his heart hammered with a mix of nerves and disbelief. For so long, he'd stood on the other side of those doors, invisible and unimportant, watching men with badges just like this one sweep past without a glance. Now, he was one of them. No, not just one of them. He was in charge. The thought was dizzying and terrifying, but for the first time in years, it wasn't fear that tightened his chest. It was something closer to pride. As he moved through the halls, people stepped aside, some of them glancing up with curiosity or murmuring greetings. No one stopped him to ask for ID. No one looked through him or around him. They saw him now. They saw the title on his badge and the resolve in his eyes. And for the first time, Ethan saw himself as something more than a washed-up soldier stuck in a dead-end job. He saw the leader he used to be, the man who'd made hard calls and lived with the consequences, who'd protected his own when it mattered. The weight of responsibility was there, heavy and real, but it felt right. This was where he was meant to be, not outside watching doors, but inside making sure they stayed secure. In that moment, as the doors to the operations room slid open with a soft hiss and the screens lit up with security feeds, Ethan understood something that cut through all the self-doubt and hesitation. Sometimes, it only took one moment to change everything. One person who looked past the uniform and the title, who saw what you could be instead of what you were. For years, he'd told himself that his chance had passed, that men like him didn't get second acts. But he'd been wrong. There were always chances, sometimes in the most unexpected places, and the real mistake had been thinking he wasn't worthy of them. A faint smile tugged at the corner of his mouth as he stepped forward, shoulders squared and eyes steady. The past didn't matter, and the doubts didn't matter. What mattered was the path ahead, the work to be done, and the knowledge that he had earned this. As the monitors glowed in the dim light and the team turned to him for orders, Ethan took a deep breath, letting the fear and uncertainty melt away. Because if there was one thing he'd learned, it was that no door stayed closed forever, not if you had the courage to knock. Sometimes, a single moment of recognition can change everything. A word of praise, a challenge issued, a hand offered at just the right time. And when that moment comes, you have a choice: to step back and stay in the shadows, or to seize it with both hands and prove that you are more than the world thinks. Because the truth is, we're all just one chance away from a different life. So when that chance comes, don't hesitate. Take it.